to our learning session, which is entitled Deaf Gain in the Philippines, Assessing Attitudes Towards Hiring Deaf Employees. So let's all welcome Tina Season, our coordinator for the research associate.
Hi, good afternoon. Okay, so let me say a few words about our guest researcher today. She's currently a faculty of the SDAS. She obtained her Bachelor's of Arts degree in Applied Studies with specialization in computer graphics, and also graduated magna cum laude in 2000. She also completed her Master's of Arts degree in Deaf Studies with concentration in Cultural Studies from Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. in 2014. She has 2 graduate awards, the George DeWitt's Deaf Studies and Graduate Research Writing Awards. Her recent master's thesis research explores the concept of deaf gain in the Philippines in relation to assessing attitudes towards hiring deaf employees. She is currently a co-founding member and president of the Development and Accessibility Fund for the Deaf Incorporated, or for short DEF, a local NGO doing fundraising projects to provide more Filipino deaf legal skills. So please help me welcome our guest researcher today, Ms. Ana Cristina Arce.
So I'm back. I'm done with the US and I'm back. Hello, good afternoon. Thank you again for coming, and thank you for welcoming me, Sid, and inviting me to present about my research. So I'm happy to share this with you. And the topic of my thesis, the research that I did for my MA, which I submitted to Gallaudet University, is this. Deaf gain in the Philippines, assessing the attitudes towards hiring deaf employees. So this is the content of my discussion today, the rationale, purpose of the study, my review of previous research questions, research methods, the results, and then the suggestions or conclusions and implications. So why did I decide to do this research? So for the Filipino deaf people, there's difficulty in finding work because of first disability, and then second is the negative impressions that companies have of the deaf. Like how do we communicate with them? There are barriers to accepting the deaf. So these are the 2 things that make it difficult for the deaf to find a job. And then there are also few researches done in the Philippines on persons with disabilities. There are about 4, only 4 that I've seen. And then also there are fewer studies on deaf workers and the attitude that employers have towards deaf workers. Para hindi masyadong stressful sa business. So now in the Philippines, what's the situation? So I found through the NSO, the 2010 census, that there are 520,850 persons who have what they call functional hearing difficulty. So, NSO, I use a small letter D because I adapt this from the NSO, or rather functional hearing difficulty, because that's what it says in the census. But the convention, what the word is conventional? So we have the convention and then we have the functional. So that's the word that they use. So that was in 2010. So I think this includes difficulty, let's say, because of old age. So not exactly deaf or hard of hearing, but a very general definition on hearing loss. And then one of the researches that I cited says that there's deaf employment is lower compared to other PWDs in selected Metro Manila cities. So the first people who get hired are the blind, and then those with mobility disabilities, and then last is the deaf. Or usually in the Metro Manila cities at least. Now, in 1992, we passed a Magna Carta law for PWDs, for equal opportunities for work. And then this was amended in 2013. So the old law in 1992 says 5% should have 5% in the government offices should hire persons with disabilities. But in the 2013 law, the amendment says 1% for all private institutions, for all private companies. So that was also included already. 1% should be reserved. 1% of posts should be reserved for persons with disabilities. Okay, and then the Philippines also ratified the UNCRPD in 2008. And that was also about equal work opportunities for persons with disabilities. So these are the laws that we have. So do you know the concept of deaf gain? Have you heard of that before? No? No? Okay. This idea came from, this idea of deaf gain was coined by, this is how you sign it, deaf gain, was coined by Bauman and Murray. One of them is deaf and one is hearing. This was in 2009. So it started in Britain. So they're both British. And they went to the US to visit. Performance, okay. Sorry. So they went to the US to visit, and in Gallaudet they saw that, they saw the performances there, and then they were surprised of the hearing loss and the stories that were experienced by the people there, stories of hearing loss. And so Bowman and Murray, these two, they discussed that why is it that the term is hearing loss when their deafness actually adds something to them? So why do we call it a loss? So they theorized that it's actually a gain. So hearing loss, right? That's what we use, like hearing lost hearing. So for example, we have a hearing loss, that's why we're unable to communicate. But if we reframe things and And if this is the former way of framing things, if we reframe it now, then it's deaf gain. It's deaf gain. It's not a loss. For example, you're lost because you cannot speak, but rather a gain because you learned sign language. And you can sign, so there are no barriers there. So it's a change of perspective, deaf gain. It's a reframing of how things are seen. Of how, not to focus on the loss, but to focus on the abilities. Now here in the Philippines, deaf people, there are some advantages. That it's possible that the abilities of deaf persons are superior than that of the hearing. So, the purpose of my research, I have three. So I focused on the attitudes of hearing employers about hiring deaf people. And then I also investigated the advantages. What does advantage mean? It means abilities of deaf people which are superior to the hearing. So for example, when we do encoding, there's no distractions. There's no phone to distract us or gossip, office gossip to distract us. And then there's the equal advantages of deaf and hearing persons, and there's the disadvantages of hiring deaf people. What this means, the abilities of the hearing that are greater than that of the deaf. And then the third is to increase awareness and advocacy, to advocate to deaf employers, deaf employees, through the Deaf Gain Media campaign, based on the results of the study. So let me just give a summary of the literature review that I did. So, attitudes affected by negative stereotypes, and then the accommodation costs of hiring an interpreter or an assistant, for example, and then the difficulties of interacting and the lack of qualifications of. And then for deaf workers, communication skills, employers' lack of awareness about the abilities of the deaf. Maybe they think that deaf people can't do certain things, and they also don't know about the law. Like the Magna Carta, they don't know the Magna Carta for PWDs. They also have safety concerns, like what if something happens in the office, how do we do this? And then also the nature of the industry, maybe it doesn't match the abilities of the deaf to be employed. In the US, the concerns were mainly about the same thing, accommodation costs and social interaction. And then, deaf workers' communication accessibility also. Now, how about other countries? So I saw research in the UK, Australia, and Iran. This is the site for Iran. So disability and communication concerns also limit opportunities for jobs. And then, there was a study about deaf gain at work. That's a US study. That they found that if you know post World War I, okay, post World War I, so it was a long time ago. I think that was the early 20th century. Companies like Goodyear tires, companies like Goodyear tires, sorry. Okay, they got deaf employees. So that company, Goodyear, the manufacturer of tires, they got a few deaf people to work in the manufacturing of the tires, in the production of the tires. And because of course it was the war, right? So they had to start getting the deaf people. So they got 400 deaf workers. And then the company realized that they worked so fast and it was better to get deaf people. So they decided, and so other companies started following what Goodyear did. That was that was the early 20th century, post World War I. And then also, another, in Mexico, the sign for Mexico is this. The government noticed like if you notice heavy traffic, kasi sa CCTV, the CCTV and the heavy traffic, they got a deaf person who just monitors what's happening and would tell what was the traffic situation. And they now have 250 deaf people doing that. Kasi ang bilis na mata ng mga deaf. So yun yung deaf game doon. And so they have work there. They have work for the government. So yun yung research na lumabas sa deaf game and work. So these are my research questions. So what are my first question my questions have sub-questions under them. So my first question was, what are the attitudes of hearing employers towards hiring deaf people? And then a sub-question there is, do the attitudes of the hearing employers towards the deaf differ? Is it different from the self-evaluation of the deaf employees on their attributes toward the job? And the second sub-question is, do hearing employers with deaf employees differ from hearing employers without deaf employees? Third sub-question, what are the reasons of hearing employers for not hiring deaf employees and their willingness to hire deaf employees? And then, do hearing employers differ from deaf employees on their assessment or of traits and competencies or the character of deaf employees considered for retention and promotion at work? My second question, again, the advantages, equal advantages, and disadvantages of hiring deaf employees. So what are these? So it's a comparison of the deaf and hearing employees. Advantages, equal advantages, and disadvantages. Now this is my research method. I did a convergent mixed method of research. That means I had quantitative data. I did a survey, and then qualitative data. I did interviews, and then I did an analysis and interpretation of the results. So what are the advantages of a mixed method of research? So I had a survey, and of course, the survey won't be able to answer why the results are certain things. No, why is it high? Why is it low? So, doing an interview will give me will be able to explain, or I will get an explanation on why certain points in the survey are high or low. So, these are the advantages of doing a mixed method. So, I also get the perspectives, the opinions, the beliefs of employers. Oops. So I don't know about the Philippines if they have this, but in the US, all students there are required by law to have an IRB, an Institutional Research Board, look into the consent information. So we submit all of the consent forms, and then it's reviewed, and then that's before we can proceed with our research. So we have a signed consent from the participants agreeing to join, that they're going to be joining the research and answering surveys. So we have a form that they read, and then they sign that. So they understand the risk of the results, that there's confidentiality also, and that that they are joining or participating in the survey and the interview. So I had to do that. So I focused my research in the Philippines, specifically Metro Manila. So this is the small part of Manila that's been blown up. So there are 16 cities in Manila, and I was able to interview from 9. So if the dark colors, this is where I got my data. Manila, Mandaluyong, Pasig, Makati, Ipis, Pinas, Muntinlupa, QC, and Malabon. So these are my participants. I had 3. I had hearing employers who have not hired deaf employees. Those have hired deaf employees, and the deaf employees themselves. There. So I gave out 57 questionnaires to those. Distribution means those I gave out. 57 to those who have not hired deaf, 53 to those who have hired, 50 to the deaf, total of 160. And my how many I got back from the 57 of companies who did not hire, 40. I got back 40 answers. From the 53 companies who hired the deaf, I got 39. But really 38 because one survey form was invalidated. The information given was not complete. And from the deaf employees, from the 50, I got 32 back. So from 160, it became 111 or 110. And then after I did the survey, I asked if they could agree to an interview. So 16 agreed to an interview, 10 agreed from the 39 or 38, 10 agreed to an interview. And from the 32, I interviewed 12. So I was able to interview 38 people in all. What did I use? My survey instruments. So I had a questionnaire that asked for demographic data, so general data, background, the company profile, and then I had trait and competence statements that I got from the research of LIM in 2001 that I just modified to fit the Philippines. So there are 30 statements. There was a 4-point scale, 1 to 4, or rather 4 to 1, 4 being important, very important, 3 important, etc. And then 0, not applicable. And then I had attitude statements, both positive and negative attitude statements that I adopted from Atelsek, Fellendorf, and etc. in 1968. And then I also modified to fit the Philippine setting. It's a 6-point scale. So 5 strongly agree, 5 to 1 is strongly disagree, and then 0 is unsure. So these are the samples of the trait and competence statements. So there are 13 samples in the survey. This is the positive attitude statement questionnaire. There are 10. So example, for deaf workers, will stay with the company longer than a hearing worker. And deaf have great power of concentration because they are not distracted by noise. So these are the positive attitude statements. And then there are the negative attitude statements. So it's the dangers of working with the deaf, or they are uninformed of the news, they don't know what's happening, etc. So these are the negative statements, negative attitude statements. And then these are my interview questions. I had an unstructured interview. So I had 40 questions for employers with deaf employees, 12 for those without deaf employees, and 10 for the deaf. And in the interview, I would ask them if they knew the law, the accommodations, the attitude that they had about hiring, the capacity at work, and perspectives, basically. So I did my analysis for the quantitative data. I did a frequency analysis using SPSS. Do you know that? So it's a statistical software, and then I did a chi-square test. So it's statistics. And then qualitative data, I did a thematic analysis. So I analyzed the interview process and looked at the themes that came out from or the similarities that came out from the interviews. So in my interview, the employers spoke in both Tagalog and English, and then this was audio recorded. So we had I had an interpreter with me during my interviews. So there was a voice interpreter, and then the interpreter, if the employer answered, then the interpreter would sign to be the answer. So they're about 40 to 45 minutes in length. And then I was able to transcribe 187 pages from the interview. So, and then for the deaf employees, it was in sign, so FSL, video recorded, and then, so interviews ranged from 12 to 44, and then I had 96 transcript pages that I analyzed. So these are the results. So the demographics first, the basic information. So employers with the deaf, employers without deaf employees. How many female? So most of them were female, 71%, and then 67.5%, and then 43.2%. And then the males, I'm sorry, for the deaf employees, there were more males, 56.3%. And then their current positions, some were HR, some were supervisor. Okay, for them. And then for the deaf, we had some who did staff or clerical work. And then we had 4 who were supervisors. And of these interviewees, for employers with a deaf, 68.4 knew of the Magna Carta, 37.5% for those without deaf knew of the Magna Carta, and 65.6% of the deaf knew of the Magna Carta for the RA 7277. So the industries they were at, so we had the hotel, hospitality and food. Hospitality doesn't mean hospital, it means the hotel, the restaurants, manufacturing. For employers without deaf, we did an IT, the BPOs, business process outsourcing. These are from other countries who call the Philippines for services. And then for the deaf, these are their industries: hospitality, marketing, education, and government IT. For the years of operation, for those companies with the deaf, about an average of 26 years, and for those without the deaf, an average of 20 years. Years of service, of those I interviewed, below 5 years. 36.8% for those with deaf, below 5 years. 40% for without deaf, below 5 years. And these are their answers to whether they will hire more deaf people in the future. So for the employers without deaf, the higher answer is no. And then only 1 said yes, they will hire more deaf people in the future. I'm sorry, employers without deaf, 21 answered no, they're not willing to hire, they will not hire deaf employees. And only 1 said yes, they will hire deaf employees. So these are the results. What are the areas of improvement for the deaf employees? Really, the perspectives is really the writing skills, sociability, being resourceful, and making good decisions and leadership. So this is a ranking. And then for deaf employees, the way they see it, the working as a team, creativity, and problem solving. This is what they saw in themselves that they needed to improve. Now for the research questions that I had about the positive and negative attitudes, or for the deaf, the darker color is the positive statement, the negative is the lighter color. So for employers, they had more positive statements, but their perspective was more negative. And these are already companies with deaf persons employed. Now for the deaf, they see themselves as very positive, and just a few said negative things. So as you can see, the perspectives of the employers and the deaf employees are opposite. So when I did the interview, these are the teams that came out. So these are for the employers working with the deaf and for the deaf employees. In the color blue font, the text in color blue are answers that came out the same for both the employers and the deaf employees. So for example, the effort of communicating through writing, learning sign language, or teaching basic sign language for work purposes. So those are the two things that came out. And then for the employers, they mentioned a sensitivity to the deaf workers. And there are some who actually consider the skills or focus on the skills of the deaf rather than the disability. For the deaf, they have issues or experiences of discrimination. They're also scared of communicating through writing with their hearing colleagues. That's why it makes them, there's some difficulty in interaction. Now, these are for employers with deaf employees and employers without deaf employees. So there are still similarities like openness to hiring deaf workers. But there are also some who said, yes, we are willing to hire if. So they have like qualifiers. And then they're not aware of the tax incentives actually. Like if you hire persons with disabilities at work, then you pay less tax. And then of course the possible conflict or the discomfort with hearing workers, like for miscommunication, for example. So again, the fear that they will have difficulties with communicating between the hearing and the deaf. Now the survey results for the employers without deaf employees, these are their reasons. Mostly it's communication that's the concern or that's a problem, 55%. And then the second is others. Maybe because wala nung deaf na nag-apply or they have a new direction, instructions from the boss, and then it does not include hiring persons with disabilities, so that's a possible thing. And the third is they find it difficult to train deaf persons. And then not qualified is one of the lower, the answers with the lower percentage. Now for the interview results, for the employers without deaf employees, what are their reasons for not hiring the deaf? They're not ready. And then maybe there's going to be a conflict with hearing workers, and they will only hire if there is a law. So sabi nga nila, hindi pa nila alam yung Magna Carta from 1992. And then for those who are willing to hire, what did they say? As long as the deaf are qualified, can do the work. And they will consider hiring the deaf or trying to hire deaf or PWDs. Try. That's what they said. Try to hire deaf people. Now the top 3 traits, remember there were 13 skills that I showed the sample on. So employers with the deaf said that these are the top 3 traits: honesty, integrity, interest, and enthusiasm, positive, and cooperation. For the deaf, they said that the top 3 traits
considered for promotion and retention are honesty and integrity, interest and enthusiasm, observance of policies. And so for the first and the third item, same perspective for both the employers and the deaf employees. Common themes that came out in the interview, and I was a bit surprised with the results, between the companies with the deaf and then companies without deaf, they see that there is a gain or an advantage towards hiring the deaf. So 10 themes came out that regarding the advantages of hiring the deaf. So 10 and 9. So is there the top 3, the top 1, and the disadvantages? I had to. So like for example, sa call center, paano yung makakarinig? Paano yung interpreters? So these are from employers with and without deaf employees. Now the result of the survey, so I was thinking, what am I going to do with the results? And I was still interested about the advantages of hiring a deaf person, and then whatever the problems there might be, and also with the perspective of deaf gain, if we can reframe that. So I thought that maybe we could ask hearing companies, or we could convince them to reframe their attitudes about the deaf through a campaign. So I used the IDA model. This was from the 1898. It's a famous advertiser. Lewis is a famous marketing advertising person from the US. So this is what IDA stands for, attention. Right? So your campaign has to be able to catch the attention, and then it has to spark interest, and then inspire a desire, and then bring you to action. So we thought of the deaf gain at work campaign using the IDA model. So I'll show you what I did. So I did this after this my graphics thing. So I listed 10 things for deaf gain. So it's just very short, 2 minutes. Quality QC means quality control.
So even if we're far off, we can sign to each other and we don't need to shout, right? Yeah. Peripheral vision. They can see even at the sides. So they really have better peripheral vision according to research. So this is spatial problem solving skills. They're able to think of the bigger picture, and they're also visual thinkers. So that's what I mentioned, that the details here are from the research. So this campaign will hopefully is a shorter way or a summarized way of explaining the research to them without having to bring my thesis all the time. So this is also about the communication, answering the communication concerns. So how do we communicate? We can write, gestures, online messaging, text, and also signing. Kasi when we sign, we can talk through glass walls, whether if our environment is loud or quiet, and even if we are far apart. Now, I'd like to ask, can you guys see, let me see if I can time you. Can you tell me where the number 8 is in the sea of number 9? Wow, so bilis sa mata niya, no? Kita ka agad kung yung number 8. So again, going back to this marketing or this advertising strategy of DefGain at work. So, it's something that catches your attention and then maybe interests you and then sparks a desire that maybe you can partner with a school or an organization to give you trainings and seminars, and that's the action that you can take. So in conclusion, general overview on the attitudes, on the advantages and traits of the companies are mostly negative. But the deaf, their perspective is positive. That even if they cannot hear, they can sign and that they are visual people. But for the companies, they also, for companies, both the ones with deaf employees and without deaf employees, they also see the advantages of hiring deaf workers. So in terms of competencies and traits, I think that's it's equal, and then for disadvantages, just one came up, which is communication. So these are the results of the research, and then the media campaign on DefGain at work can help reframe Philippine employers, and then they can look at work what the DefGain is, and then the possibilities of accepting deaf people in companies. Because if you remember, in Mexico, like what I mentioned, in Mexico, they got 250 deaf and hard of hearing people to do the CCTV work, right? And that's really, so if you compare with competing companies without deaf workers, parang mas umasenso yung company na merong deaf workers. So yun yung DefGain nila. And then the research, I think, can lead towards betterment of deaf lives, not whatever the problem or the issues are in the Philippines. No, not just in the Philippines, but all over the world. The problems of the deaf, the research can contribute to improving deaf lives all over the world. And let's say this material done in the Philippines can be replicated in other countries like Japan or maybe China, and it will be a DefGain advocacy. So what are the implications or the recommendations that I have based on the study for employers? Whether or not they have deaf people, maybe they can make manuals or guides about working with the deaf, what they can do, how they process hiring, getting interpreters, and other background information about working with the deaf. There should also be FSL training and working with other institutions or organizations. Let's say a company doesn't know what to do, then at least they can get someone who is knowledgeable in that field and they can partner together. For education, okay, with most of the companies without deaf people are in IT and BPO. And the BPO industry, I think, is the top 3 in the Philippines, right? So, and there are a lot of deaf people who, and they're hiring a lot of people. There are a lot of deaf people without jobs. So, yes. Now for education, yun, we can offer IT, hospitality, and then update curriculum, and partner with industries. Let's say, for example, the graphic and the business courses, we can work together with companies on that. And then for government, we can do campaigns, dissemination on the laws, like a lot of companies don't know about the Magna Carta, so then the government should be able to inform companies and other individuals about this. And then for the deaf people, deaf people's network of support. So campaign on the deaf gain at work to employers. So that we can show these to the employers and we can advocate. There, that's it. Thank you. So before I end, maybe I'd like to thank the World Deaf Leadership Scholarship who gave me the grant that allowed me to work on this thesis. Kasi kung ako lang mag-isa, magtatrabaho, hindi ko kaya yun. So the grant helped me finish all of this in 1 year. And then also my thesis committee, the members of the thesis committee, like Dr. Bauman, who was the department chair of Deaf Studies in Galadec, and Dr. Rosalinda Ricasa, if you know her. She's also a member of my panel who helped me a lot. She was my advisor in the thesis. She gave me feedback. And I'd like to thank also SDEAS and CPD, the Center for Partnership and Development, for helping me look for companies to contact to interview for my thesis. And also PMAP, the Philippine Management Association, People's Management Association of the Philippines, who gave me their directory and who helped me look for interviews also. And thank you to Pinasi for helping me out with the interviews for interpreting for all the help in this research. Thank you. Now we have time for some questions. Maybe you are curious and like to ask some stuff about her research. So sabi ni Maya's question is, it's a very good topic. How about some of the companies, like the word of abuse, no, yung deaf abuse. So like for example, hearing company oppress the deaf, for example, in the work that they do, that the worker are still very patient, but are there companies, did it come out that there are companies that are abusing of the deaf? And then Anna says nothing came out in the research, or not connected to her research. And then sabi ni Giselle,
Reaction.
Thank you, Anna, for such very insightful. Yes, we need a lot of research about deaf employment. Not only how many are employed, mga ganyan, but how do we make it, how do we, as faculty, do the change dun sa ating mga estudyante? Make it happen. Kasi remember, one part of employment is also the employment. Okay? Yesterday, I attended the Asian integration forum on employment. I just want to add dun sa things that we need to teach also our students. Part doon, ang laki ng part pa rin yung kailangan research. Kasi yung Asian integration, they say, by December 2015, 10 countries under the ASEAN will now be integrated in terms of economics, in terms of jobs. So, ang challenge doon is how to make educational institutions be at par with other countries, that's 10 countries. So we can also be employable dun sa other 10 countries. Okay. Sa ngayon, ang Philippines is the biggest unemployment rate, which is 7.3 compared sa pinakamababa na 0.4%. That numbers go down. So, that's, hindi pa kasama yung PWD yun kasi walang data. Okay, but that poses a challenge now, us as an educational institution, secondly, as a PWD educational institution. Kasi we're not yet talking about what the PWD is, or even the deaf. How do we become at par with the deaf in Singapore? Or in Thailand? Or in Malaysia? Yan yung questions. Okay. Aside from the skills na kailangan, pinoint out ng mga ILO, International Labor Organization, and a human resources person, aside from the skills, we also need soft skills. That they're now looking for employees to hire that can be problem solvers, that are critical thinkers, okay, that are creative thinkers. Hindi lang yung sunod na sunod, but can solve a client's problem. So hindi na lang siya magaling sa Photoshop. Creatively, paano nagagamit yung Photoshop to solve a certain problem? Magaling siya sa math, but how can you do math na creatively can help yung data can help the business? So, ganun na yung hinahanap ngayon, hindi lang basta skill. Okay? On the positive side, yesterday when Ms. Nikki asked me to give the background ngayon ng graduates natin, of the 371 backdash graduates, the good news is we have 43% with work.
Dati nasa 60 yan eh.
Dati lang. Good news siya compared sa walang trabaho na 35%. Malaki, di ba malapit. Wala lang tayong data sa 16%. So very important din, you feed us data saan pumupunta yung mga bagets at mga estudyante. So, 35% walang work. So, hopefully now, 2 weeks ago, we were talking to 3 companies na interested about the deaf. That's positive also. You know. But again, babalik tayo. Anong skills, anong attitude, anong communication skills that we can offer to these companies? On the onset kasi, we always tell our deaf that you are now representatives of the school of a Binilbian education. Okay, so ang first choice pa rin sa deaf employees na yun are Binilbians. Napaswerte tayo doon. But right now, companies are also opening up. Tama yung sinabi ni Ana, to people in wheelchairs, to ortho, to the blind. Yun yung competition natin ngayon. So yung 1% PWD requirement is not the deaf requirement. So, doon sa 1%, makikihati tayo sa ito. Makikikompete tayo sa ito. So, really, I put a lot of challenge sa ating faculty to help dun sa development ng mga estudyante natin, not only to be skilled, but also to be relevant sa company. Then, dagdag din doon sa sinabi ni Ana, yung English. Kasi may BPOs na nag-hire ngayon, but English communications is really a must. Sagot doon sa Myra ng deaf, we should not look at the perspective of a deaf, deaf abuse agad. Okay? Yung deaf abuse, punta sa office. Report sa dole. How do we know it's abuse agad? May mga trainings naman tayong ginagawa, how will you know if you're abused? Sexually ba? May take advantage sa'yo? Hindi ka ba pinapasweldo? Okay? So yung mga ganon. Kasi ang maraming trabaho is normal for any company. Ang maraming trabaho, and it is not that abuse pag marami kang trabaho. Promise. Okay? Doesn't mean ina-abuse ka. Ibig sabihin lang nun, the company may have a lot of clients.
Any other questions for Ana? Anyone else? Okay. Si Raymond. So yung pag-hiring ng deaf, what are the usual work? Do you have statistics on the work? And then, sabi ni Ana, hospitality, so hotels. And then, marketing is a second. And then, education, government, and then IT. Any other questions? Comments? I can sign for myself. Okay. So, kanina yung... Hindi, ayoko sa konsip.
Factor talaga yung attitude sa work. Kasi what I tell students is your grades can get you hired, but your attitude can make you remain or can make you stay long in a job. So I think if us as faculty and counselors can observe mga attitudes nila na we think will be harmful to them in the workplace, so dapat ma-address natin ito pala. I know mahirap ang attitude or character formation, but how they work together in a class, when they work together in a project, may sumbong dito, sumbong dyan, parang dito na makikita na natin yung negative, pag madala nila sa workplace, medyo na. So, yun, malaking tulong din for us ang counseling na teachers would come to me, si Ana, so ko yan, na I observe na ito estudyante, may ganyan yan. So, it helps us in the counseling to address certain attitudes and immaturities ng mga estudyante na dapat mawarin. So, if you have complaints with your students, it will help us to work on it.
Any other questions? No more questions?